Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Cheryl Dunn, and I'm here to demonstrate a problem called Services Galore Inc. Read the narrative that you're given for Services Galore Inc. As you can see, the requirement for this problem is that we're going to take the scenario that's described in the narrative for this company and use it to create an REA business process level model in UML class diagram format. And then we're going to take that model that we create and convert it into relational database tables on paper. Just the schema for the tables. We're not putting data in them. So we'll just be coming up with the column headings that need to be there for those relational tables. When we started a REA UML class diagram, the first thing we want to do is to identify the duality relationship for the transaction cycle that we're working with. So in this case, we're dealing with a revenue cycle. And in that revenue cycle, we're going to identify, first of all, an economic decrement event, and an economic increment event. An economic decrement event is an event in which the company gives something up. In this case, what they're giving up is services, and so we're calling this a service engagement. And the event in which they are receiving something is a cash receipt. We then connect the two through a relationship that we call duality. That answers the why question. Why is a company willing to give up services? It's because it's going to receive cash in exchange. Once we identify the economic decrement and increment events, we need to connect those events to resources to represent what is being given up and received. The resource that's involved in this company is a very abstract resource that we're going to call service type. We're going to refer to it as a resource type, although it also could be referred to as an event type. And technically, what the company is giving up is really labor. Labor is very abstract and intangible as far as measuring and trying to get the decrease amount. And what many companies do if they are selling services is they simply use this service type class to substitute for the labor that's given. So you can think of the service type as sort of like an inventory of the services that the company has available to sell. We call this relationship between a resource or resource type and an economic decrement event, we call that stock flow in REA. And because each association must have a unique name, and I know that we're going to have more than one stock flow relationship, I'm going to label this one as stock flow 1, and then the next one that we're going to do in a minute here will be stock flow 2, and that will keep the names unique. The resource associated with cash receipt is also a resource type. This one is less abstract than the service type is, but still we're not able to track the individual dollar bills and quarters and things like that that cross our company's desk. Instead, we're tracking the cash accounts at the account level. And so we'll have an instance of this set for each different cash account that the company owns. And so it's a more abstract level than specific dollar bills or things like that. And so it's going to be at the type level. This again is a stock flow relationship. And so we're going to label that as stock flow 2. Next, we look for the internal and external agents associated with our events. And so for the service engagement, we're going to look for an internal agent. And for this one, it will be the engagement employees. And they will be connected to the engagement event through a relationship we call participation. And we'll call that participation 1 because we will have multiple participation relationships. Next, we'll look for an external agent associated with the engagement, the service engagement. And our external agent is going to be our client. And we'll again call that participation, and this time it will be participation 2. The client is also connected to the cash receipt because the cash receipts come from the clients, and that will be participation 3. And then finally we have an internal agent associated with the cash receipt event. And that is the cashier, or the set of cashiers, as is the appropriate way to say it. And that's going to be connected to the cash receipt, and we'll call that participation 4. Okay, once we have our diagram in place with our different classes and associations, then it's time to assign the attributes. Take a minute and look at the attribute list that you are given. We need to account for every attribute on that list, and we need to not add any attributes to that list. Okay, the first attribute on the list is service type code, and that's going to be the primary key of our service types. That's an identification code that the company is making up to identify the different types of services that it can provide. And one thing you're going to see with this list is the first several items are primary key attributes. That's not always the case. Sometimes they're more mixed up than that. So don't expect to always see a bunch of primary keys at the beginning. But in this case, our very first one is a primary key of service type. The next one on the list is the invoice number for the services rendered, and that's going to be the primary key of the service engagement class. Then we are given the remittance advice number, and remittance advices are documents that are used to track cash receipts, and so the remittance advice number is going to be the primary key of our cash receipt class. We're also then given the cash account number, and that's going to be the primary key of our cash class. Next, we're given our client number. That's going to be our primary key of our client class. Next, we're given the cashier social security number. Now, the social security number is not an attribute that we really want to use as a primary key. And so I'm going to put it down lower on the list because I happened to look ahead in the list and I saw that later on in the second column it gives us an employee ID that we're going to keep track of both for cashiers and also for engagement employees. And we would rather use an assigned ID number for our employees as primary keys instead of social security numbers for security reasons, because oftentimes primary keys of one class, once we convert these into relational tables, we will end up posting the primary keys from some classes into other classes' tables as foreign keys. And that would mean storing that social security number multiple places in our database. And for security reasons, we really would rather not do that. And so most companies will instead create an employee ID of some sort that they can use as the primary key instead. And that's what they have done in this case. We can still store the social security number in the cashier table, but we just don't want to use it as the primary key. So it's fine to put it in there. We just want to protect it a little bit by not making it the primary key. Okay, the next attribute that we have to deal with is the engagement employee's highest degree. And that's going to be an attribute of the engagement employee. It doesn't matter what order we put these attributes in. I'm just kind of going by my personal preference, but the order doesn't matter because, again, the purpose is to make this diagram into relational database tables and then put them into database software. And after that, they can be sorted into any order, so it doesn't matter what order they're in. It does matter that we designate the primary key, and we'll learn how to do that in software eventually as well. The next attribute we have is the total charge for the service engagement. That's going to go on our service engagement as a descriptor attribute. Next we have our employee wage rate, and we're going to track that both for our engagement employees and also for our cashiers. The next attribute we have is the cash account balance. That's going to be an attribute of the cash account class. Then we have our client name, which will go on our client class. Then we have our cash account location, which will be an attribute of cash. Then we have our customer accounts receivable balance. That's going to go in our client table because, again, our clients are our customers. Next, we're going to put our cashier phone number in our cashier class. Then we have our hourly billing rate for a service type. And the next one is the service type name. And then we have the type of cash account, whether it's checking or savings or some other type of a cash account. We're going to keep track of that there in the cash class. Okay, so we've accounted for every attribute on our list, and the next thing we want to do is to assign multiplicities to the associations in our class diagram. Okay, first we'll take a look at our duality association, and we'll ask the questions that we need to answer in order to get the multiplicities. So we'll start here and we'll say, must every service engagement in our system be related to a cash receipt? In other words, can we put a service engagement into our system without also putting a related cash receipt? And because the problem tells us that the customers are going to pay us on the 20th of the following month for any engagements that we've had for them this month, that means that we want to be able to put the information about the service engagement in as it happens, and then we won't have the related cash receipt until next month. So we need to make that a zero minimum multiplicity next to cash receipt so that a service engagement need not have an immediate cash receipt entered along with it. The next question we ask is, may a service engagement relate to multiple cash receipts? And because they're going to be paying for all of the service engagements from the prior month on the 20th of the following month, that means that there's just going to be one payment for each service engagement. It's going to be one cash receipt could apply to many service engagements, but each engagement would be paid for with just that one payment. And so we've got a one maximum on that side. A cash receipt doesn't have to pay for a service engagement. We can have cash receipts from other things like bank loans. It tells us the majority of our cash receipts for this company are from clients for service engagements, but we do have some from bank loans and other sources. And then, as we said, one cash receipt can pay for many service engagements because of that arrangement where they pay on the 20th of the following month. We then look at our stock flow relationship, and we ask whether a service type can exist in the system without a related service engagement. And it tells us in the problem that they want to be able to put information about service types and clients and employees and cash accounts and things like that without before transactions involving them occur. And so we know that we want to be able to put the service type in there before any service engagement occurs. And then the same type of service could be performed on multiple engagements. So one service type can relate to multiple engagements. We could do cleaning services on several different jobs, for example. Then we ask ourselves, can a service engagement exist without a related service type? And that wouldn't make any sense at all. If we're doing a service engagement, it must be for a type of service. So that's going to be a 1 minimum. And then can any service engagement involve multiple types? And it's not talking about is there a realm of possibilities that's bigger than 1. It means if we look at any one service engagement, for example, invoice number 2, is that for multiple types of service? And it tells us in the narrative that for this company, each service engagement involves just one service type, that if we're going to perform multiple types of service for the same client, we're going to break it into different service engagements. And so each engagement involves just one service type. And so we have a 1 minimum and a 1 maximum. We then look at stock flow 2, and we ask ourselves, must every cash account have a related cash receipt? And here's one of those where they have told us specifically that in order to start a bank account, a cash account in the bank, or to enter the information into the database, we must have identified at least one cash receipt associated with that cash account. And so a cash account must involve at least one cash receipt. And then we ask, can a cash account have multiple cash receipts deposited into it? And of course that would only make sense. And so that's going to be a many maximum. We then start from the cash receipt side and we say, must every cash receipt correspond to a cash account? And what that means is we're going to designate when we receive the cash what account it's going to be put into. And so the answer is yes, we would be designating a cash account. If we haven't put it into a bank account yet, then it's going to be sitting in our undeposited cash or cash on hand account. That still is being associated with an account. And so the cash receipt will correspond to a cash account. And if we look at any one cash receipt from a customer, is that one cash receipt going to be put into multiple cash accounts? And the answer is no. Any one cash receipt would not be split between multiple accounts. It will just go into one. And so that will be a 1 maximum. And in seeing this box here, I realized I skipped an attribute. I don't know how that happened, but we also had a cash receipt amount that should have been given to the cash receipt class. Okay, between service engagement and engagement employee, we ask ourselves, must every service engagement involve at least one engagement employee? And the answer is yes. And then could a service engagement involve multiple employees? The answer there is yes. And so we have a 1 many on the employee side. Then we ask ourselves, must every engagement employee be assigned to a service engagement? And here again, we use that sentence that says we need to be able to put information about employees into the system before transactions involving them occur. And so we're going to say that the employee does not have to have a service engagement, because when we first enter the information about the employee, they won't have served on any engagements yet. It doesn't mean that we don't expect that they will, it just means they haven't yet. And then can one engagement employee serve on multiple service engagements? Absolutely. And so that's going to be a many maximum. Next, we look at the client to service engagement relationship, and we ask ourselves, must every client relate to a service engagement? And in this case, we want to put information about the clients in our system before the transactions involving them are entered as well. And so we want to put in a 0 minimum. And then can a client relate to multiple service engagements? We sure hope they will. We want to sell them many different kinds of services at different times, and so we want them to participate in multiple engagements. Must every service engagement relate to a client? Well, we certainly wouldn't be performing them for anybody else. And then may a service engagement relate to multiple clients? That wouldn't make any sense at all. We would have to make those different service engagements if they're for different clients. Then we look at client to cash receipt, and we ask ourselves, must every client relate to a cash receipt? And again, because we want to put information about the clients in before transactions with them occur, we're going to make that a zero minimum. Even if we didn't have that policy in place, the fact that we can perform the services for them before they pay for it means that we would need to make that an optional, even if that one was a mandatory. Then we ask ourselves, can a client relate to multiple cash receipts? And we sure hope they will, because we want them to pay us lots of times and have us do multiple services for them. Then we ask ourselves, must every cash receipt relate to a client? The answer is no, because it says that we do have cash receipts from other sources such as bank loans. And then may any individual cash receipt relate to multiple clients? And that wouldn't make any sense either. The cash receipt would have come from just one client, and so that will be a 1 maximum. Then we look at the cash receipt to cashier relationship, and we ask ourselves, must every cashier relate to a cash receipt? Again, we need to put information about the employee in when they're first hired before they've done anything, so we make it a 0 minimum. May a cashier participate in multiple cash receipts? The answer is yes, so we'll make that a many. And then we start from the other side. Must every cash receipt be processed by a cashier? And in this case, they are all processed by cashiers. And in fact, it tells us that each cash receipt is processed by exactly one of the cashiers. And so that gives us both the minimum and the maximum of 1. Okay, so that's all of our multiplicities for this problem. What we do next is then we turn this diagram into a set of relational database tables using the multiplicities on these associations. The first thing we want to do in creating the relational tables is to create a table for each class. And so we're going to take each class in this model and turn it into a table. So we'll start right here with service type. And I'm going to use a shortcut notation where I simply put the attributes in parentheses rather than showing them as tables with rows and columns, because we're not putting data in them, we're just giving the column headings. And so we're going to say that our service type code is going to be our primary key. And then we'll also have the service type name and the hourly billing rate. Then we'll look at our service engagement class and make that a table. That will have the invoice number as the primary key. And it will also have the total charge. We then add our engagement employee. That will have the employee ID as the primary key, and then also keep track of the wage rate and the highest degree. Then we have our client. We'll make a client table that will have the client number as the primary key. We'll also track the client name and the accounts receivable balance. Next we have our cashier. Our cashier will keep the employee ID as the primary key. We'll also track their phone number, their wage rate, and their social security number. Next we have our cash receipt table. We'll use remittance advice number as the primary key, and then we'll also keep track of the cash receipt amount. And finally we'll set up a cash table, and that will have the account number as the primary key. We'll also track the location, the type, and the balance. So that's our start to making our relational database tables, but we're not finished yet. The next thing we would look for is if we had any association classes, we would make each of those into a separate table as well. In this case, we don't have any association classes, so the next thing we look for are any many-to-many associations. And when we talk about many-to-many, we're talking about associations where both maximums on one relationship are many. This is a one-to-many relationship. This is a one-to-many relationship. This is a many-to-one relationship. But here we have a many-to-many. Between service engagement and engagement employee, we have both maximums are many. That means we need to make a separate table for that participation one relationship. And it's going to have the engagement invoice number as part of its primary key, and it's also going to have the engagement employee ID as part of its primary key. So it takes both the invoice number and the employee ID to uniquely and universally identify each instance of that participation one table. And so that will take care of that relationship. We don't have any other many-to-many associations, so the next thing we would look for is if we happened to have any relationships where we had 1-1 on both sides. If that were the case, we would need to think very hard about whether those are really two different things or whether they should be collapsed into just one. In this diagram, we don't have any relationships like that, so we don't need to worry about that. So the next thing we want to look for then is any that have a 1-1 on one side or the other, because that's an easy decision to make. For that decision, we want to post a key from the 1-1 side to the other side's table, because in doing so, the one maximum guarantees we won't have any repeating group problems. A service engagement must only involve a maximum of one service type. So if we post service type into service engagement, there would be a maximum of one value to put in there. And the one minimum guarantees that there will be a value to put in there. So we won't have any null values if we do that. So we'll look at this stock flow one relationship first then, and we will post the service type code into the service engagement table. So we would simply add service type code, and then we're going to put a little FK by it to indicate that we understand it's a foreign key in that table. And that will take care of that relationship. Next we'll look at stock flow 2 because that one also has a 1-1. In this case it's on the cash side. And so we can post the cash account number into the cash receipt table. As a foreign key, we will have a value for each cash receipt related to the cash account, and we'll have a maximum of 1. So we will have no null values, and we will have no repeating group problem. And that will take care of our stock flow 2 relationship. Next we'll look at our participation 2 relationship because that also has a 1 and a 1. In this case, it's on the client side, so that means we can post the client number into the service engagement table. And so we'll go up here and we'll add client number as a foreign key. Again, it won't cause any null values and it won't cause any repeating group problem because of the 1 and the 1. Then we'll go down to participation 4, because that one also has a 1-1, and that means we can post the cashier employee ID into the cash receipt table. And so we go down here and we put in cashier employee ID as a foreign key, and that will take care of that association. So we have 2 associations that we have not yet implemented in our tables, and one of them is duality and the other is participation 3. And the reason we skipped those as we were going through is because they don't have a 1-1 on either side. They've got a 0-many and a 0-1. 0-many, 0-1. We know that we cannot post from the many side to the other side. If we were to post invoice number into the cash receipt table, this fact that we've got the many would cause a repeating group by definition. We might want to consider posting the cash receipt number into the service engagement table because of the fact that we've got a 1 maximum. We won't have any repeating groups. However, because of the fact that we have a minimum of 0, that means we will be introducing at least 1 null value into the service engagement table. So the question is, how many null values would we be introducing? As long as we would have what we call a high load, meaning most of the values would have real values instead of blanks or nulls, then we would want to go ahead and post that key. And in the narrative, it tells us that almost all of the service engagements will be paid for. Think about it. If most of the service engagements were not going to get paid for, we're not going to be in business very long, right? Because the service engagements that don't get paid for are either they're not due yet or they're a bad debt. And so we would expect that eventually most of our service engagements would end up getting paid for. And so it would be okay to post that remittance advice number into the service engagement table. And we make that a foreign key. And that accounts for duality. Now the last relationship remaining is participation 3 between client and cash receipt. Again, we cannot post cash receipt into client because as soon as we receive a second cash receipt from the same client, we would have no place to put it without causing a repeating group. On the other hand, if we post client ID into the cash receipt table, we'll only have a maximum of 1 value to fill. We'll have some null values. So the question is, what percentage of our cash receipts come from clients as opposed to other sources such as bank loans? And it does tell us in the problem that most of the cash receipts do come from clients, and therefore we would be fine posting the client number into the cash receipt table. Again, as a foreign key. We then just close up our tables now that we've got all our posted foreign keys. And that concludes our creation of our relational database table schema. The next step, if we were continuing this problem, is we would take these tables and we would put them into a database software package such as Microsoft Access or Oracle, and then we would create data to go into these tables as well. Thank you for watching this demonstration, and I hope you found it helpful.